And our first presenter this afternoon is Dr. Nancy Tennant, who's Vice President of Unleashing Innovation Emeritus at Whirlpool and a faculty member at Notre Dame. And she also was telling me that she teaches at the University of Chicago as well, where I went to undergraduate. Please welcome Nancy Tennant.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, because of Whirlpool's relationship with the Edison Awards. Whirlpool was fortunate to be in the running a couple years and won a few years ago. But it's also exciting to be here with Notre Dame and to see it firsthand, because it's my first experience. I want to spend the next 10 or 12 minutes talking to you about how you transform companies to be more innovative. So it's a little bit of a different perspective than maybe a lot of the speakers that we've heard. But most of my expertise, all of my expertise, is helping companies that are what I call legacy companies transform themselves to be innovative. In fact, that's the role I had at Whirlpool for about 17 years before I retired last summer. And that's what we're teaching now at Chicago and at Notre Dame. So let me just talk about this. Before I go on, it says companies, but this also applies to nonprofits, not-for-profits. For many years, for about 4 years, I was the CEO of a not-for-profit in Benton Harbor, Michigan, using all of the innovation tools and skills that you all know how to do to try to transform that not-for-profit, and working with some other ones, as well as with government. 1 year at the University of Chicago, I ran a lab, and my students went to work for the state of Michigan to help them try to understand how they could be more innovative. So even though it says companies, it's more than just companies. It's really organization innovation. I think about innovation, I peg it about the mid-90s when it really came into our consciousness in companies. Probably started with the Gary Hamel, C.K. Prahala article talking to companies about how to think about top-line growth. And so in a sense, it's not a very old science, if you will. It's relatively new. And unless you're a company that started from day one being innovative, maybe like Cisco or Apple, but if you're a company like Whirlpool, you were not really built to be innovative. In fact, all of your systems and processes are built to do just the opposite. They're built to control variance. They're built to make sure that things are repeatable. They're built to solve problems that basically have been solved before. And so when innovation comes in the mix, it's really hard in a company to kind of transform to not kill innovation. And so what I want to talk about are just 3 platforms that companies need to think about, or organizations, if they want to change from a legacy company to be very innovative. The first one is how you generate innovations, and I'll do a bit of a deep dive in this, but basically you all know how to do this. This is what's happening in this room. This is the sexy part of innovation. This is the fun part. This is coming up with the idea and getting it to market. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but if you're an organization, there are 2 other platforms you have to think about. One is how you embed it. How do you change your company, change the DNA in your company to make innovation work? Because the truth is, if you start generating in a company like Whirlpool without doing the work to change the DNA, the half-life on that is about 18 months before the organization, the systems in the organization begin to slow it down or kill it. So we'll talk a little bit about this embed piece. How do you embed innovation in a legacy company? And the last one is how do you lead innovation? And we'll talk about that. So there's just really, I'm trying to just very simply talk about 3 ways that you can do this, 3 platforms that are necessary. Let's look at the first one. The first one is how you generate innovation. And we heard earlier today in the first panel talking about, not only do you need the idea, but you need a process or a protocol. And unfortunately, process in companies kind of gets a bad rap. But the truth is, if you're a large company like Whirlpool with engineers and people around the world building refrigerators, washers, et cetera, you need a process. And in our case, we decided we needed a common process. So in the books that I write in my teaching, I'm kind of process agnostic. You can use IDEO, you can use Strategos, you can use any process you want, but you have to articulate that and have people understand that. So that's the first piece. The second piece is understanding the kind of innovation you want. And in this case, Whirlpool's case, we wanted open and we wanted innovation from everywhere and everyone. We wanted every employee around the world involved. And Whirlpool, when I left last summer, had 100,000 employees. We started this in '99. We had about 70,000 employees. So the question is, how do we reach out and how do we train people? How do we equip them? Not just with resources and money, but how do we teach them how to innovate? So that's the second one. And the third one is something we're talking about at the table, which is one of the things we decided to do is we wanted what we call iMentors. They're like Six Sigma people for innovation. And we wanted them in every location. We wanted them trained on our process so that if someone came up with an idea and needed help, or if we wanted to pull an innovation team together, they would facilitate that team through the process. At the high water mark at Whirlpool, we had about 1,200 of these people trained around the world. Very rigorous training, understanding, and the example I have here is the unifying methodology that we use at Notre Dame. But you recognize that, how you do discovery, ideate, elaborate, and launch. We added in this methodology framing, because in a company it's kind of important before you start to frame what you're getting ready to do so you can get alignment, leadership alignment, et cetera. So that's the iMentors and the kind of teaching people how to facilitate. But the generate piece is not just about unleashing it all. We really have to teach people. We have to build it as a core capability in companies. So that's the first one, that's generate. This is the iMentor program. If you have a chance to talk to Matt and I, this is a year-long program that Whirlpool, Beacon Health Systems, and the University of Notre Dame built to train iMentors in an open enrollment program. So it's a very rigorous program. We teach them a unifying model. We teach them facilitation skills. We teach them organization skills. So at the end of a year, they come out very, very skilled and have this skill set to get teams from A to Z in innovation. What's unique about the program, it's practitioners teaching practitioners and co-creating. So it's people like myself that have been on the front line, in my case for 20 years, trying to understand innovation and all these other companies involved. So if you have a chance, stop and talk to Matt and I about the program. So that's the first one, generate. The second one is a little bit harder. And if we were going to put these three things on a sexiness scale, like, you know, generate would be really sexy, and lead would be somewhat sexy, and then way over here on this continuum would be embed. Embed isn't kind of the most fun thing to do, but if you're in an organization, you have to think about this. Embed is how do you change the DNA in your company? I work with Gary Hamel, the famous strategist, and he's a colleague of mine, and he has this great story about embed. And what he says is if you want to change a company's DNA, it's a bit like teaching a dog to walk on its hind legs. Like, we know it can be done. You take a dog biscuit and you hold it in front of the dog and the dog stands up on its hind legs. Of course it can be done. And what happens when you turn your back on the dog? Does the dog say, you know what, this is great, who knew I could walk? No, the dog probably gets back down on all fours because the dog's DNA isn't to walk on its hind legs. And it's a bit like that in teaching a company how to innovate. Our DNA isn't about innovation. Our DNA is about something else. So you think about, how do you think about innovation as a core business process in a company? That's really the outcome. How do you treat it like everything else that's important in your company, like free cash flow, like quality, like safety? Whatever are those core processes, innovation should be parallel to that. And here I just say there's probably three big things. There's probably more, but to think about three things. One is to understand how innovation fits in the strategic architecture, how it fits in the vision and the mission, and to make sure employees understand that. In most of my classes, I have about 70 people, and when I start this section, I ask the students who come to exec ed from companies, how many of you can describe to me your strategy? And how many of you, how many hands do you think go up? Less than half. It doesn't mean their company doesn't have a strategy, but they can't describe it. So we have to spend some time having people understand kind of the sandbox, if you will, of where we want innovation so they know what they're working on is important for the strategy. So that's the strategic architecture. The second one is, it's the really hard one, and it's why I think most companies can't transform themselves. Because you have to make all of these systems that run the company visible, and you need to begin to re-engineer them. Let me give you an example at Whirlpool. When we started in 1999, Whirlpool's a fairly large company. We would do budgeting, and you may do budgeting like this too if you're in a big company, in January. The VPs would set the budget, we would freeze it, and that would be the budget. And so if I am an employee of Whirlpool and I come up with an idea in the middle of the year that costs $12,000 to implement, there's no money because it's all been allocated. And so that's a good example of how do you change the budgeting system. In our case, we started with seed funds and put seed funds out so employees could access money to innovate. And then over time, that became part of our budgeting system. So that's just an example that there are all these systems that are going to work against innovation. Financial systems, planning systems, operating systems, HR systems. How do you pay people? How do you recruit people? How do you train people to be more innovative? Over time, those things need to be re-engineered so they don't kill innovation. And of course, you can't do that all in 1 year. You would like bring the organization to its knees. So you have to figure out which are the big ones and start working on re-engineering those. And the last one is the culture change and the transformation. And just understanding that it is an organization transformation or change when you begin to bring innovation into a legacy company. So that's number 2, that's embed. That's the changing the DNA and how you make this sustainable and how you make the generate, number 1, work. The last one is lead. And think about how you lead in this new innovation economy. There's a lot of leadership technology and theory that most of it was created around the Second World War, maybe in the 50s. And so we're in this whole new space and very little work to date on these new leadership skills required. But a few clues here. One is somebody in the organization, and it's usually leaders, have to kind of unleash innovation. They kind of have to say, here's the sandbox, maybe here's the process, and get it started so that people, and have an approach. Is it going to be everyone? Are we just going to buy? Are we going to partner? Are we just going to do open? What is the approach we're going to take to innovation? So that's the first one is, as a leader, you have to understand your role and generate. When we started at Whirlpool as a senior leader, and I was included in this, I thought, this is great innovation. I'm going to go and invent the next refrigerator. And it's not that we didn't want senior leaders inventing things, but what we really needed them to do is to change the systems and to create the space for innovation. So that's the first one. The second one is this whole embed. I mean, think about the example I gave you on the budget. You can't change that as a grassroots effort. You can't have innovation teams work and say, you know what, something's wrong. Let's go see the CFO and see if he or she will change the budgeting system. It's got to be something that senior leaders take seriously and have a strategy of how they're going to change the systems they control to allow innovation to thrive. And then the last one is, there's this really great article. It came out in the beginning of the 2000s. It's by Heffitz and Laurie. And it's on adaptive problem solving. And it says the world is divided into 2 things, technical problems and adaptive problems. And technical problems have been solved before. There's a protocol. They may be very difficult to solve, but there's a protocol. Think about quality and safety, and almost everything in our organization is a technical problem. But innovation comes in and it's exactly the opposite. It's an adaptive problem-solving skill set. It says, what's the biggest idea? What's the newest idea that has not been tried before? And so as a leader, you need to begin to develop and adopt these adaptive problem-solving skills, like saying yes, like using and, like understanding how networks can come together, like understanding lateral leadership and distributed leadership and not having to control everything. So there's some skills to learn to make sure that you are on the front leading edge of converting your company. So I'm going to stop. I just want to do a very brief kind of simple way to think about the 3 platforms that you need to change a company. First, you need generate, which is how you start with an idea and get it to commercialization, whatever is the right process for you. Secondly, the most important one, but the least fun one, is embed. How do you ensure you have a cadence of innovation? By changing the management systems. And the third one is lead. What's your role as a leader, a senior leader in your company to make sure that these first 2 things happen? So I'm going to stop and see if you have any questions.
How do leaders deal with chaos?
Thank you.
I'll repeat them back.
Thank you. We could have a whole discussion on how you get leaders ready to do this. There's this famous saying that the bottleneck is at the top of the bottle. You know this saying? And at least when we started the transformation of Whirlpool, most of my time, and I worked for the CEO, and his time were spent on that. Not necessarily just on chaos, but just kind of opening their aperture to allow some of this chaos to happen. And so I had this strategy. It was kind of a sneak up on them strategy. And so I would always assign a senior leader to an innovation team, and I would give he or she the accountability to kind of be the mentor. But in fact, they were learning kind of firsthand about chaos and about kind of understanding the tools and techniques. So we had different ways to do it, but it's a problem. And usually when you start a transformation like this, and you can kind of see why, especially when you understand embed, the second part, is that the biggest bottleneck is at the top.
Nancy, here, let's help the video guys out by being up on stage.
Okay.
It just puts us both in the frame here for
Okay.
a second. I've got one question, and then I see a question in the back there. How do you measure outcomes and from company to company? Because I think a lot of people, okay, now I'm in the innovation team, and oh, I'm the embed, and great, we're innovative, we did it. The process becomes the outcome. How do you prevent that? Because innovation, you know when you see it, but you don't necessarily know it before you see it.
Yeah, it's a great question. Whirlpool, we were about 2 years into it when we realized we had an issue. That was, we had all this innovation going, but we couldn't define it, and therefore we couldn't measure it. Like if I would hold this up at Whirlpool and I'd say, I just invented this and it's really innovative, and you'd say, that's not innovative. So we spent a long time trying to figure out what's the criteria for a product or service at Whirlpool that it has to meet to be innovative. And we said it has to be 3 things. It has to be, for us, unique and compelling to the consumer. So nothing like it in the marketplace, and the consumer has to be wowed by it. Secondly, it has to create a competitive advantage by sitting on what we call a migration path. So if you're an innovator and you come up with an idea, we say, well, that's not good enough. We want to see the next and the next and the next. So we want to see the migration path. And thirdly, and this was the one that was hard for us, but it makes sense, consumers have to be so wowed by it, they're going to pay more for it. So if you think about washers and dryers, an example, think about the washers and dryers your mother or grandmother, most women, had, and then think about these new front loaders that are energy efficient and have steam, and you're so wowed by it that the price point is 2 or 3x. So the answer to your question is, for us at least, once we could do that, then we could start counting things. Everything didn't meet the definition. It was still important to us, but the really top things met the definition, and then we could start tracking them. And we could count, and our CEO could go to Wall Street and say, we've created this much new revenue because of our innovation process. So that's how we did it. That's how we began to measure it.
But it's something that you have to actually focus on. It's not something that's going to happen by itself. In the
That's
back, Chambers said if you can't get it done in 3 years, you forget about it. And there's so many of these 10-year cycles in planning. How do you deal with speed?
Thank you. You know, I'm going to use a Whirlpool example again. At Whirlpool, when we started innovation, we would build platforms like a dryer platform. Those platforms, when we started, would last 20, 25 years. We'd change the features, but the platform. By the time we started really getting innovation, that cycle had decreased significantly to like 4 or 5 years. The same with how long it took us to actually design and build it. And so once we could measure it, we could track it through the pipeline to see how long it took us from idea to launch. And we began to put metrics around speed. It became very important for us. So it's a great question.
One last question right here. Thinking about large-scale enterprises where there are all kinds of different sub-enterprises within them that have different methodologies, different cultures, different DNA. How do you enforce an innovation process across a large-scale company, say as large as 100,000 employees, when you have the potential of people saying, well, it doesn't work for us, it doesn't work for us?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, Whirlpool, just to start there for a second, is in the same business everywhere in the world. So it's a little easier for us. And it's our culture to do everything together so we can measure it and track it. But I'm working with a really large company. I'm actually headed there next week that are in very different businesses. And what the CEO in that case said is each of you need to figure out your definition and how you're going to measure it. And we'll roll it up and manage it that way. But each of you need to figure out kind of what it means for you and manage it accordingly. So it varies on your company's culture and just the way you run the company.
We'll conclude with this, and I've always wanted to ask somebody this, because I used to drive to college at University of Chicago from Grand Rapids to Chicago, and I'd go through Benton Harbor, and you'd come around the corner on I-96, and wow, you know, it's like, oh, this is where it is, you know, and there's something about the Whirlpool brand that really changes your mentality, and there's a sort of a magic to it, because if you think about it, one of the most terrifying things on the planet is a whirlpool. I mean, you don't want to get stuck in it. You don't want to get caught in it. You don't want to go anywhere near it. If it's near you, you're dead. Black holes are whirlpools. I mean, everything that is like totally destructive in every way is a whirlpool. How did you take that name and make it so benign?
Well, you know where the name comes from. It comes from the agitator and the Whirlpool.
And
we originally weren't called Whirlpool. We were the 1900 Corporation. We were formed there on the banks of the Lake Michigan through a partnership with Sears, which is what started. And by about 1930, we decided to adopt the name Whirlpool, and it was because of the agitator. Washers no longer have agitators in them, but the agitator, and it would get your clothes cleaner.
No, yeah, but it's still, you stuck with it. I mean, I have to say,
we stuck
it's
with
quite amazing.
We did
Thank you so
stick with
much.
it.
Thank you so much.